and welcome to the interview. For 30 minutes, we're trying to get at the angles not being explored in the national media and dig beneath the headlines to ask the esoteric questions that no one is asking that might help us really understand what's going on, bringing clarity and challenging assumptions. On that front, we're tracking major developments in America's trade policy. The United States is preparing to levy steep new tariffs on imports from the European Union and Mexico. Supporters say the move will protect American jobs and bring back manufacturing. Critics warn it could raise prices for consumers, strain global alliances, and destabilize markets. Dr. Michael Greiner, an expert in the economy, joins us now from Oakland University, a favorite of ours. So let's begin, Dr. Greiner, with whether tariffs are becoming a permanent part of our economic strategy.
Well, it's hard to say. You know, this is part of the problem that we're dealing with right now, which is the level of uncertainty that has been brought by this administration to the tariff issue. You know, a great example of this to me is what happened with Brazil recently, where the president has threatened substantial tariffs against Brazil because of the fact that they're prosecuting the former president of Brazil, who I guess had been involved in essentially an attempted coup in the country. At least that's their position. And President Trump doesn't like the fact that they're pursuing that, and so as a result of that, he's threatening to impose tariffs. Now, there are a couple of issues with this. The first one being that the president really doesn't have authority to impose tariffs based on political issues like that. The authority that he has to impose tariffs, and granted there is some authority, albeit limited, is based on trade issues, where if somebody is treating us unfairly on a trade issue, then the president has the authority to essentially fight back. But when it comes to political issues, he really doesn't have that authority. That's not what the statute says. So that's one concern. The second concern is that the United States is actually a relatively low on the list of priorities when it comes to Brazil's list of trading partners. In fact, its largest trading partner is China, second largest being the EU. So as a result of that, I think I read that Brazil's that trade with the United States only represents about 2% of Brazil's economy, a very small percentage, which they can easily transfer to somewhere else. So the threat that's being imposed upon them, not only is it based on something that really isn't logical or anticipated, but it's also based on something, it's not going to necessarily be very effective because, frankly, Brazil doesn't really care. So those are two of the issues, and it kind of raises a question of, is there really a strategy here? And I don't know that there is. You know, another example here would be the tariffs that you just mentioned about with Mexico. Mexico and the EU. Their tariffs are being increased up to 30%. Well, Canada's currently are 35%. That's the tariff rate that they're facing. And the justification for this is because of the amount of fentanyl crossing the borders of these two countries. Well, as it turns out, barely any fentanyl crosses the border between Canada and the United States, whereas a substantial amount of the fentanyl crosses the border from Mexico to the United States. Now, it makes you wonder then, why is Canada being subjected to higher tariffs than Mexico? So this is the problem that we're dealing with here, is that it's a moving target. And the business people I talk to, what their biggest concern is that they really can't plan for the future here. They don't know when they're going to be tariffs or not tariffs. They don't know if this is going to be a long-term strategy or short-term strategy. I would say one thing, that some recent news that has come forward seems to indicate that it might be an attractive thing to keep going, and that the amount of revenues that are being brought in by tariffs actually is surprisingly high. And so that could be one thing that the government says, you know, oh, we can use this to try to essentially offset some of the tax cuts that we have elsewhere in the economy, to try to, I guess, reduce the budget deficit, as it were. But it's really only a drop in the bucket compared to the entire budget deficit. And it makes you wonder then what's going to happen when the next administration comes in. Will they continue tariffs? Will they get rid of tariffs? Who knows? And that's the problem that these businesses are facing right now. You know, when an auto company decides that they are going to invest in a factory, they have to make that decision with a 5-year timeline ahead of them. And to be able, because of the amount of time it takes to build that factory and to staff it and to be able to put all the equipment in it. And the investment they have to make sometimes as much as $1 billion or more. So to make that kind of commitment, they know that over the long run, this is going to be something that's going to pay them a really valuable return on investment. And with this uncertainty in tariffs, they just can't be sure about that. And that's really the biggest issue that we're facing right now.
So we will get into some strategies that have been leaked on the internet, a few that certainly are informed by the people who are advising the president, including Secretary Scott Bessent and others who say that this is part of a chaotic strategy. Again, we'll dive into that a little later. But I do want to talk to you about industrialization. The United States was a major industrial power up until basically 2020. And then we saw a decline. And now we stand behind China. And the first trade war clearly didn't change that trajectory. But this may be the only way to ameliorate that situation, which is what economists say, that if you want to reindustrialize, tariffs are one of the only available tools to do that. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, I would dispute a couple things there. Number one, I think that the biggest issue that economists point to in terms of the trade deficit, what we call the current account deficit, actually has to do with the level of investment that we have in the United States relative to the amount of savings that we have in the United States. And a big portion of that, of course, comes from the federal budget deficit. I mean, the fact is that there's a lot of investment of foreign dollars into the United States, including in terms of people overseas buying U.S. Treasury bonds, essentially lending money to the federal government. Well, that's one way that U.S. dollars get bought up overseas and get sent back into the United States. Now, that deficit there has to be filled up somehow, and the way that it gets filled up then is with the sale of goods, obviously. So that's actually what is the biggest driver of the trade deficit. Now, is it possible that tariffs could somehow make a difference in one industry or another? And that is certainly the case. We've seen an example, for example, with the steel industry, where they're very excited, actually, about some of these steel tariffs because of the fact that it results in protections for domestic industry and allows them to be able to essentially charge more, make more profits, and bring back some production to the United States because the overseas competition ends up being more expensive. There are also examples of where certain countries have engaged in, you could say, unfair practices, things like dumping, where basically they produce something lower than the cost and sell it lower than the cost that it costs to produce it, so that they destroy the domestic industry, and then they're able to increase the prices, essentially, where they've got a monopoly on that good then. And that could be another example of where tariffs make sense. But the problem with tariffs is it picks winners and losers. A good example of the loser in a lot of this actually appears to be the auto industry, something that is near and dear to our hearts here in Michigan, obviously. And the auto industry has really been struggling, reason being that a lot of the parts that it uses to produce these vehicles, including the metals, for example, to produce these vehicles. And we have a great example in the recently announced copper tariffs. That a lot of these metals now, the increase in the metals, obviously, to produce the vehicles is something that then goes directly to the bottom line of the automakers. Now, thus far, we haven't seen a huge increase in the price of vehicles because the automakers had built up a huge inventory, and so they've basically been selling that. But at a certain point here, that is going to impact the pricing, and we've already heard announcements, for example, from where they've said that they're going to have to increase their prices as a result of these tariffs. So and another example I would say is retail. Certainly retailers here in the United States, they're impacted by the tariffs, and they need to turn around and essentially pass them on to the consumers. And that's one of the things that I think is the untold story here. And we need to make a decision. Is there going to be some impact on some industries relative to other industries as a result of tariffs? Probably, I can say that's probably the case. Is there a counter effect, which is the impact on consumers' wallets? Definitely. I mean, this is a tax. It's a tax paid by consumers, and we need to stop kind of pussyfooting around the issue that this is something that American consumers are going to pay. If they're willing to pay more to have certain industries benefit from that, well, so much the better. But I think we have to be realistic about the fact that this is not going to result in some huge increase in industrial jobs as a result of these tariffs. You know, one final point I think that's really important to make here is that relative to the entire U.S. GDP, the gross domestic product, manufacturing actually has not changed in the level of its contribution to the GDP since the 1970s. Okay, now this is kind of the untold story here. So the big decrease in the number of people working in the in manufacturing is largely driven by automation. I mean, you go into an auto factory now, and anybody who hasn't done it, I would strongly urge them to do this. It's a marvel of ingenuity. You don't see a lot of people standing there, even welding or putting pieces on vehicles the way you used to. Now they're largely driven by robots. And the big call that there is actually are for highly trained engineers. It's worth pointing out, by the way, at one point, President Obama had actually asked Steve Jobs, who is then the CEO of Apple, what would it take to bring back manufacturing of the iPhone to the United States? And Steve Jobs' response is, you can't do it. Reason being is we don't have enough engineers here in the United States. So as a result of that, it's kind of a moot point here. Yes, can we bring back some manufacturing to the United States in certain industries? Yes. Is that worth paying the tariffs that are being paid? Well, that's really up to the American people. Is that something that could impact economic growth? Also, yes. And is it something also that's a very regressive tax that's paid for mostly by working people, middle-class people, lower-income people, relative to their total income, as opposed to the very wealthy? Also, yes. But if you really want to affect the overall trade imbalance that we've got, the best way to affect that actually would be by reducing our federal budget deficit, for example, and somehow encouraging more saving within the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm someone who's always going to bring up the debt to GDP ratio, which is unsustainable in the minds of many economists. But I think when you compare the amount of manufacturing output, which, to put a finer point on that, in 2021 was about $2.5 trillion, again, behind China. Yes, you can look at it as a percentage of the GDP, and that tells one story. Here's the other part of the story. The fact that manufacturing jobs and employment in this country are the lowest they have been since 1950. So the jobs are not there, even though our output is greater. And some of that is due to what you already alluded to, which is inflation. So that brings me back to the auto industry, which you talked about. And, you know, the Biden administration took a very aggressive approach, some said too much, in trying to put these stipulations on how many new electric vehicles it wanted by 2030. All of that, of course, has fallen by the wayside. But it does bring up the point of whether targeted subsidies are maybe appropriate, say the Ramsey optional model, where putting some money from the government, using tax money in those areas, might be an effective way for us to sort of blunt the effect of tariffs and maybe see reindustrialization when it comes to the auto industry, and even see our car companies be the most dominant in the world. Certainly, Tesla is, and many foreign automakers are making a lot of vehicles in the United States. What about that element, the idea of using subsidies as a way to offset the effect of tariffs?
Well, I mean, that's certainly been done. For a great example of that, for example, would be back during the first Trump administration, when essentially, because of the tariffs on agricultural products, the administration basically gave all kinds of money to farmers and was able to offset the costs there. So that's certainly something that can be done. You know, I find it ironic, by the way, that we're talking here about targeted subsidies, because of the fact that traditionally, the position of the Republican Party has been to essentially say that we should not be picking winners and losers, that we should let the free market do that. And here we are saying that, no, we're going to provide subsidies to essentially pick winners and losers, counter to what the market is doing. Now, the bigger concern, I think, in this respect, actually, would be what are we subsidizing? From a long-term perspective, I'm very concerned about the United States' overall ability to compete internationally. I mean, let's face it, the United States' strength globally is our ability to innovate and our ability to come up with new products and services that excite the world. I think that while we're talking about Apple, we talked a little bit earlier about manufacturing the iPhone. But the irony is that most of the value of the iPhone actually is produced here in the United States. The design, the software, the services, all that is done here in the United States. And of the total cost of an iPhone, which can go up to about $1,000, I think about $100 of that is the production of it. So that's a very small piece of it. And that is driven by the fact that we have here in the United States some of the greatest universities in the world. I mean, let's face it, you look at a list of the greatest universities of the world, and that list is dominated by universities here in the United States. I'll tell you one story here that's kind of illustrative of that to me. I got my PhD at Wayne State University. Great university. I'm very proud of that fact. But I mean, let's face it. If you were to ask somebody overseas what are the greatest universities in the world, I would acknowledge the fact that probably most people would not list Wayne State University as one of the top. In fact, if you even ask people what are the best known universities here in Michigan, you'd probably go a couple down before you got to Wayne State University. So that kind of gives you an idea of the overall view that people have of U.S. universities, especially given the fact that when I was working on my PhD, I used to joke about the fact that I was the token native-born American. Most people there were people from overseas. They were from places like China, from Korea, from Ethiopia, from all over the world, from Russia. And as a result of that, we even this university that, let's face it, is kind of a mid-tier university, is something that's attracting people from all over the world to come and study here and essentially create new knowledge here. And that's really where the United States has gotten its long-term competitiveness. And I'm afraid that the United States might be falling behind on that. A great example, I mean, you mentioned the fact that people said that the Biden administration was too aggressive with supporting electric vehicles. Maybe so. But I mean, that is the future here. There is a future here. And if you look at the way the world is going here, in Europe, for example, you're starting to see a higher and higher percentage of the vehicles sold being electric. And I believe in Norway now, more than 90% of the vehicles that are sold on an annual basis are electric. And guess who's producing those vehicles? They're the Chinese. Why? Because the Chinese subsidize their electric vehicle manufacturers. And guess what? If you go to Shanghai, then you see electric vehicles all over the place. So we're essentially allowing our competitors to go ahead of us. That's my big concern here. Are we trying to compete with these countries in a manufacturing basis? Well, maybe. Again, these things seem very short-term when we're looking at tariffs because, again, we're not investing in the thing that's going to give us that long-term competitiveness.
Yeah, let's talk about long-term competitiveness, which the president has alluded to a number of times. And I have to say, you shouldn't down Wayne State University. It's a great university, and many family members.
I went there. I'm not.
My mom actually turned down a full ride to Yale to go to Wayne State University because she was a first generation to go to school, right? And her parents were like, you can't go. You have to stay here. So she went to Wayne State University, got a world-class education. Anyway, back to the point. Back to the point. Reserve currency. The U.S. dollar is a reserve currency of the world. Looking at the U.S. dollar index, you know that it has seen a retreat of about 10 to 11% over the last year. The dollar is not strong. Well, there are some theorists, and we're going to get to the eventual Mirren plan, so I want to leave some time for that. But there are theorists who say if you look at the retreat of the dollar, that 10 to 11% over the past year in the U.S. dollar index, there is no way to keep the dollar strong, keep our reserve currency, keep it as a reserve currency of the world, our reserve currency status, and simultaneously reindustrialize America. You cannot have it all. Therefore, the solution is to reindustrialize America, weaken the dollar, which actually should have a positive effect on inequality to some extent, and at the same time keep the US dollar as a reserve currency of the world, that you really can only have two of the three, and that is a viable strategy to try to create chaos, and chaos that hopefully will benefit the American people and add to manufacturing jobs and how much is made in the United States. Can you have all three? Is it impossible to have all three? And if it's only two, which two?
Well, that's a great question, and the problem that we're dealing with here again is, a little bit of the horse has left the barn. I remember the 80s. I was a child in the 80s. I was a college student in the 80s and came of age then. I graduated from college in '89. So I remember back then when manufacturing had more employees, and there was kind of this sense that we were starting to lose our edge with manufacturing. I remember that there were certain industries that had been supported by different subsidies, which went away as a result of the fact that these subsidies were terminated, largely as a result of the Reagan administration coming in and saying we did not want to create kind of pick winners and losers. A great example of that, for example, would be the shipbuilding industry. The United States used to have a huge shipbuilding industry, and during the 80s, that basically went away as a result of the fact that we stopped the subsidies for it. Now, is there any way that we're able to bring back the shipbuilding industry to the United States? Probably not. But I remember back then saying that, what we needed to do is kind of give up our idea that we need to essentially defend the dollar. That's the policy that there is, that we want to kind of have the dollar as the reserve currency. And, kind of give up that policy of defending the dollar and let its value fall so that American goods would be more competitive on the global stage. Well, as it turns out, that ship has sailed. At this point, the American goods that are still manufactured here are competitive on the global stage. I mean, let's face it. For them to survive at this point, they have to be. The question is then, how does the dollar help us? Well, one thing that is true is that having a weaker dollar would make things more expensive for Americans. I mean, there's no faster way to increase inflation than to decrease the value of your currency. I mean, a great example of this, if you want to really look at something extreme, would be what was going on down in Argentina until recently. Yeah. The fact that their currency was declining very rapidly, and as a result of that, there was massive inflation. Now, do I think that's a concern here in the United States? Probably not. But the fact that the currency does decline in value does mean that for goods that are imported, that Americans are going to be paying more for them. And this is kind of the undercurrent of a lot of the discussion here. We have some choices that we have to make. The choice has been driven in the past that we wanted to essentially support the American consumer. And we saw in the last election that American consumers, frankly, are pretty strongly opposed to any kind of inflation. I think that most analysts agree that that's what drove the election result that we saw. Are we willing to then pay more for certain goods with the understanding that it will help us? It will help us perhaps bring back certain industries back here to the United States. Again, with the caveat that the kind of employment that manufacturing used to have, that no longer exists anywhere. I mean, even if you go to large manufacturing facilities in China, they do not use the number of people that used to have in any kind of manufacturing facility. So that is a question that I think is a legitimate policy question that needs to be posed to the Americans. And I think the way you pose it is exactly right. You cannot have it all. And there has to be a decision of what is the priority of the American people at this point.
Okay, let's talk about Stephen Mirren, who, as you know, is advising President Trump. He is a key advisor, probably only second to Scott Bessent. And he has said that this creation of injecting policy uncertainty into the trade war is part of the deal, because then you'll prompt retaliatory tariffs, and ultimately, because so many economies want to ship their goods into the United States, they're sort of left with not very many options. Now, what happened during the last trade war is China, for example, would sell to another company or to another country, and then they would sell to us, as an example. But with the World Trade Organization diminishing projections for 70% of economies in the world, as the saying goes, if the United States catches a cold, the rest of the world is going to have a full-on flu. And so the United States has a much better bargaining position. Miran is a Harvard-educated economist. He's, he invests in our nobody's fools. Does this type of policy uncertainty make some kind of sense, especially in a game theoretic model where you're signaling total confusion, which in turn will benefit our hand eventually, and that these kind of extreme measures are really the only way to turn the tide?
Yeah, I think that there's actually something to that. I think that the place, though, that really you can see the kind of impact that you have with this type of confusion, chaos policy, more would be on foreign policy, for example. There's they talk about the crazy man theory, which is that because of the fact that other countries are afraid of what Donald Trump might do, that he's crazy enough to actually do something that could be damaging to them, they might back off in a way that they might not have done otherwise if you had a more predictable president in charge. So that's kind of there is something to that. And I think that you could argue that in certain circumstances, that kind of confusion might be valuable in a trade war situation. The concern that I have with this is twofold. Number one, again, as we've talked about earlier, is the confusion and chaos also impacts American businesses. And that's really the biggest concern that we have here. Fundamentally, we as economists say that our goal is to increase the size of the economy. That's what our goal is. And if we want to increase the size of the economy, is the way to do it by imposing tariffs? Generally, I think you'd find almost universal agreement that that is not the case. Because of the fact, twofold. Number one, as you know, the American economy is 70% driven by consumers. So if things cost more for American consumers, that's going to hurt the economy overall. Secondly, if businesses are unable to kind of make long-term commitments based upon the fact that they know that there's going to be a certain policy in place, then that's going to reduce business investment. And actually, we've seen pullback in business investment of late. And that's been something that I think has been a concern. And from all the business people, and I talked to a lot of business people, and they're all telling me that the reason that this is happening is because of this policy uncertainty. Yeah. So the question is, yes, there's this twofold impact. And then the second thing that I would add is, if there were a goal that you were trying to achieve, if there were a specific bargaining point that you were trying to achieve, maybe this would make sense. But when you look at the tariffs that countries like, for example, Europe or Canada were charging us, that they were minimal. And the fact that, or for that matter, Mexico, and the fact that suddenly these tariffs are being laid onto these countries, there's a lot of outrage among the policymakers from these countries because they're saying, wait a minute, here we are negotiating, we're trying to give you something, well, we don't have anything to give you. Because the tariffs are already low. So there's this big question of, what can these other countries do to mitigate the tariffs? And that's where I think really the question of some chaos theory kind of falls on its head.
Yeah, well, I think it's about time for us to wrap this up. There are a lot of questions also about whether or not we're going into a recession. The yield curve has shown this very interesting tension. The labor market is still pretty good. It's unclear. It doesn't seem like there's really any signs, but then who knows what's going to happen with the gross domestic product, which we've talked about several times and we'll again. So I want to thank you so much, unless there's anything you wanted to add in literally 30 seconds, because that's all I have to summarize.
No,
this.
It's just I want to remind people of that old Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. We're certainly living in interesting times now.
Yeah, we definitely are. And by the way, when you brought up this notion of the Republican Party and what their interests are and what they might be, for me, especially in engaging in this, I think more of us need to do a better job of engaging every single kind of debate, sort of sans any of it. If you're a Republican or a Democrat, whatever it is, I think, when we engage it, our goal is obviously to be as fair as possible and to call out the hypocrisy or concerns on either side. So with that, I want to thank you, Dr. Michael Greiner, for joining us as always and giving us your very interesting insights.
Great to be here. Thanks, Hilary.
Thank you.